Well, good morning, everybody. So we've been talking about investing your money wisely and not investing it wisely, right? FSELX, right? Less volatility. Brian suggested green light. You can even buy fractional shares of securities if you don't want to spend the entire amount for something that you're interested in, which is very interesting. So the rollout associated with the litigation is coming out supposedly the week of June 25th. That's when we should anticipate all the forms changing, not all the forms, but a substantial number of forms changing in your zip forms library. The lawsuit probably won't be signed until November 25th or so, and that always gets extended. But we're going to begin making those changes anyways, whether we want to or not. And a big change is associated with the buyer representation agreement. And the agreement can be both non-exclusive, and that's the default, or exclusive. Non-exclusive, I can represent a buyer, you can represent a buyer. Theoretically, we don't have competing interests for the same type of property or location. And then exclusive, just like a listing contract, an exclusive listing contract, no matter who the buyer buys through or what they buy, you're entitled to a commission based upon the criteria associated with your contract. Now, this is interesting. The maximum representation period allowed is 3 months from the date this agreement is made. So the default time frame in this contract is now 3 months. I don't know why. I don't know if it's part of the limitation associated with the litigation, but that is what you're fighting here. So it's going to be very difficult to cross that out and make a change and expect your client to sign that.
I get it. I mean, 3 months is, I think, enough time to see whether your agent's doing their job and whether you like working with them. That's from the consumer standpoint.
It's not from my standpoint.
Yeah. I can see why they would do that.
I guess so. Maybe it's easier to have your client sign the representation agreement, especially a non-exclusive, exclusive agreement. That's really the direction we want to go in, so you're assured of being compensated. The representation period is very clear. So it's going to begin on a date and end on a specific date. And then A2 type of representation, non-exclusive is the default. And there's a dramatic difference between non-exclusive or exclusive. And let's go down. I just want to skip to this section because I want you to completely understand why you want to pursue getting an exclusive agreement. First of all, the contract also gives a 30-day cancellation period for an exclusive contract. So either party can cancel with 30 days written notice. If it's exclusive, the default time frame is upon delivery of a cancellation notice, unless you change that. Let's go down to 4B. Let's talk about the difference between non-exclusive representation, broker involvement, and exclusive representation. So section 4B1, compensation is payable only if there was broker involvement with the property. So this is for non-exclusive. Broker involvement means any of the following. The buyer physically entered and was shown the property by broker. Broker showed the property to buyer virtually. Broker submitted to seller a signed written offer from buyer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property. Or broker performed a market analysis related to the property or reviewed property-specific documents or disclosures with buyer. Or the property was introduced to buyer by broker, or one for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. So sending a list of properties or just putting them in the client gateway is not a valid basis for you to be compensated if you have a non-exclusive agreement. So you can see there are tasks that must be performed for you to be entitled if you have them sign a non-exclusive agreement. And then you can see in section 2, it talks about exclusive buyer representation. Let me just jump down to there so you can see the difference between the two. Exclusive representation. The agreement shall be exclusive and irrevocable. We're going to dedicate time. Then it also says buyer shall not enter into another representation agreement that conflicts with it. And then compensation. Broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period with or without broker involvement. So you see the dramatic difference. If they sign an exclusive agreement, no matter who they have helped them not where they buy, because you have to be specific, the county, city, something like that. But if they buy a property, you're entitled to compensation. Whereas non-exclusive, you're going to have to demonstrate that you performed various tasks to be entitled to the property, not just putting them in the client gateway. So that is a dramatic difference when you're talking about you being entitled to compensation and you spending your time.
It's interesting how they separated the paragraph to like 2 pages down.
Yeah, it is. So it makes it difficult. I would think if I'm sitting with a client and I'm going to complete section 2A2, I don't think it's going to be that much of an issue to say exclusive, meaning you're obligated to pay me no matter what. But we're going to have to initial another paragraph, unfortunately, in section 14 to once again, so they confirm the fact that they're agreeing to an exclusive representation. Under section B, this is just talking about the description of the property that they intend to acquire. So excluding B4 and B5, it talks, if we look to the right, single family or residential, including condos and manufactured homes, you can see there's various descriptions for multifamily, vacant land, industrial, or you could even say SFR is excluded from this agreement, which is a single family residence. You could say that, but the default is single family residential. That is the default in regards to the buyer representation agreement. Location, you can be very broad. You can specify counties or cities. If your client is concerned, then narrow down the scope possibly. But no matter what, even with the exclusive representation agreement, they have to give a 30-day notice. And likewise, you're entitled to give a 30-day notice. So if you have a total contract period of 90 days, they're not going to know that they don't like you, at least for the first 15 days. So you're going to have them locked in for a 45-day period at minimum. And then additional description, if there's something else that they would like to describe to you, or section B4, we check the box, the following specified properties only. Maybe they don't want to give you an exclusive representation agreement for anything they look at, that you're taking them to see specific properties. You can identify those properties, and no matter who represents them, you're entitled to compensation. Now, I think if I'm a buyer, I'm not going to want to be signing multiple documents. I'm more likely to work with one agent that I'm very comfortable with. And then B5, the properties identified on the attached list, if we were to attach a list. And then B6, properties excluded from representation. So perhaps they have had a non-exclusive agreement with another agent. They were showed various properties, or maybe that agent gave them information in regards to those properties, completed a market analysis. The buyer should be telling you that those properties, if they were to buy that, are excluded from your agreement, meaning you're not entitled to compensation. That's their obligation to notify you. So it tells you if they're working with somebody else. That's really the benefit of it. It's going to bring that out. And then section C, additional buyer preferences. Now, this form is somewhat useless. You can attach this. And of course, it asks for information in regards to the type of properties in which they have expressed interest. So maybe you could also, there's some people, depending upon the culture, they may be very adverse to somebody dying in a property. Maybe that's a question you should ask them up front. Let's exclude those properties because you can be assured that they're not going to go forward with the property in which somebody died. If they tell you that, so ask them up front. Be courteous, help them. Let's see, any questions about that? So all we did was talk about identifying the properties subject to the contract that we now have with our buyer. The next section, D, you can see it's highlighted in gray and red. Ideally, all the red's going to go away. I'm sure the gray bar is going to remain. But this is solely associated with compensation. And it continues to say throughout this agreement that compensation may be negotiable. It may not be with you. You don't have to negotiate anything. You can tell them, this is what I'm willing to work for, but you may be willing to negotiate. Section D1, amount of compensation. We can insert a percentage, for example, or we can put a dollar amount. based upon the purchase price. Section D2, so that's really no different than a listing contract or the current buyer representation agreement. You can even put, if you see there's different boxes, you can put a dollar amount or pursuant to the compensation schedule. Maybe you give them consideration. If you buy a property for $1 million, you're going to pay me 2%. If it's 2 million, maybe you pay me 1.75%. You can create a graduated schedule. There's nothing wrong with that. And then section D2, payments from third parties shall be credited. So those payments shall be credited against buyer's obligation to pay broker. Broker shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 2D1, and that's the amount that you specified that you're intending to earn, unless that amount is modified in a subsequent written agreement between broker and buyer at the time the overage amount is known. And then if broker has a listing agreement with the seller, we'll refer to paragraph F or 4F. If I'm representing the seller, simply the compensation the seller is paying me will not be used as a credit to offset the compensation that the buyer owes me. So it's explicit in that. Otherwise, if it's compensation offered by the seller or compensation offered by the seller's agent, that is used as a credit against the money that the buyer owes the buyer's agent. And I believe ultimately the total commissions that are going to be paid to the listing, good morning, and buyer's agents are going to be fully disclosed to all parties at the close of escrow also. So they're going to know. There's no question about that. And then the other thing that comes up when you think about it, right now, usually when you're representing a buyer and there's compensation offered on the MLS, typically what we see the listing agent notifying escrow of the compensation to be paid to the listing office and to the office representing the buyer. And then you'll receive notification from escrow asking you to confirm that amount. So now, because in the event there's no compensation, first of all, there will be no compensation offered on the MLS, you're going to have to submit some type of documentation, most likely to escrow, to validate the amount of compensation you're entitled to. You may have to set this buyer representation agreement. It acts as an irrevocable demand. Keep that in mind. And because the listing agent is not going to know what you're being paid. And then also there may be negotiations between the buyer and the seller that the seller is paying for the buyer's agent's commissions. So that's an opportunity also that would offset the buyer's obligation. So escrow is going to have to calculate that. And then now also, if there is any type of compensation that's being offered by the listing agent, you'll have to actually have a signed CBC, and we'll go through this, cooperating broker commission form, validating or documenting the amount of commission that the listing agent is paying you. So it could even be a combination of the listing agent signing a cooperating broker commission document stating I'm going to pay you 1.5%. There could be negotiations between the buyer and seller, documenting the fact that the seller is going to pay the buyer's agent 1%, for example. So those are all things that are going to be coming into play. And unfortunately, the complexity increases in regards to just these, what used to be a simple calculation for everybody.
So escrow is going to have to learn these contracts too, right?
Right.
Escrow is going to have a very clear understanding of what's going on. Exactly.
Do you have to disclose both sides, whatever you earn as opposed to the commission?
I would say at the close of escrow, both parties, buyer and seller, are going to be made aware of the total commissions paid to each agent.
Okay.
So initially, well, if you're representing the buyer, you're not going to know what the listing agent's earning. Likewise, the listing agent is not going to know initially what the buyer's obligated to pay you, because you're going to have a contract that you don't have to disclose to the listing agent. But it seems like in many cases, I think that when presenting an offer, you're going to be asking the seller to pay a certain commission, or the listing agent has an opportunity to offer compensation through other means besides the MLS. And then on the MLS, the other thing that's going to be available to everybody will be a field in which the seller's offering concessions. So that is a field that is permitted, but in no way can they indicate that it's to be used for commissions, but it can be applied against commissions or any other buyer closing costs.
So is it possible that as a seller agent, like for instance, I ask for 4% commission and then I paid 1%?
Yes, you can.
I can.
You can do that. Yes, correct. It is negotiable, right? And I think that's part of what we have to tell them. Do you think you're going to attract more buyers and more agents if you're offering no compensation?
So in this case, I can, sometimes there are agents that they might demand more commission from the seller,
Mhm.
that's what they're going to pay.
I think that's going to happen in almost every single circumstance.
But in reality, they won't deliver what they say to sell up to, right? Because for instance, I was talking to an agent, and he was saying that we charge, in Northern California, he was saying that we charge 6%
Mhm.
the seller, but we only pay 2.5% commission to a buyer. agent.
That's okay. That's perfectly
So
acceptable.
it could be the same thing. So I tell the 6%, 6%.
Mhm.
But again, I tell them that this is between me and the buyer agent.
Mhm.
But in reality, I won't share it equally, right? However I want it.
Well, it depends. The current listing contract allows you to do that.
But not the future.
Not the one that's going to be rolled out late June. It's going to specify because the payment to a cooperating broker or the buyer's agent is going to be optional on the listing contract. And it spells that out specifically. It says optional. Do you actually want to offer compensation? Whereas the current listing contract, you can take a 6% listing. You don't have to fill in this space. There's no obligation to fill in the space how much you needed to offer to the cooperating broker. And that would allow the listing agent to make a decision how much they wanted to offer the cooperating broker. But that's not going to be the case. But the other difference is currently when the listing agent offers compensation, it's on the MLS and it's a contractual offer of compensation. Whereas there is no further contractual offer of compensation. They're going to be advertising it and you're going to have to document what that compensation is. So they may say on their website, we're offering 2% to the broker representing the buyer, but you're going to have to submit to that agent a cooperating broker commission form documenting the amount of money they're going to be paying you.
So it's not gonna be available to get commission from MLS.
It will not, yeah.
At least in agent. But what about if buyers, I mean, the seller say, yeah, let's offer 2%, how you communicate to the people of the MLS that.
Well, maybe it could be the company website. It could be the flyers you advertise, or somebody calls you. If I'm an agent representing a buyer, at minimum, I'm going to give you a call or I'm going to send you an email. What are you offering? And if you look at the MLS and you just see under the concession field, they're offering concessions. I think that's key right there.
Is it a special form between two agents?
The cooperating broker commission form, CBC. It's a form that's been in existence for a long time, but it's been modified now to be rolled out once again the week of June 25th currently. Masood, do you have a question?
Oh, no,
Okay.
I just want to say private, like description.
Uh-huh.
Bottom. State that.
No, you can't.
Because it's in the MLS.
Nowhere. Nowhere in the MLS can you state that any compensation, anything that's being offered is for commissions.
So you can't just write this in there, it is like 2%, like as a description.
You cannot.
Bottom.
You can say 2%, but I guess there's going to be a concession field. We're offering a 2% concession. That's all you can say. And I'm sure they're going to come out with a hefty violation for somebody that offers commission on the MLS in the private remarks or something like that, is that's going to be violating the settlement. Then we're going to be back in litigation again.
So 2% toward the closing.
Yeah, you can just say offer concessions or just say we're paying X amount towards closing costs. Yeah.
Sorry, like you might have already come up with something for if like the selling side doesn't offer a commission and our agreement with like the people that we're representing on the other side, we say we want 4% of whatever and they agree to that. But on the selling side, they offer like
The listing side, you mean?
Yeah,
Okay.
so like if the listing side says that they offer 2%,
Mhm.
and we already have an agreement with the buying side,
Mhm.
like for 4%, say,
Right.
does the buying side still cover the full 4 or only 2?
No, they get a credit of 2%
Okay,
offered by the listing office, but they have to pay the difference.
the other,
Yes.
okay,
But then that's a discussion that you're gonna have to have with your client to say, I'm worth 4%, and that's why you're gonna come out of pocket for 2%, even though the agent who's listing the property is only paying 2 out of the 4% you owe me.
so it's kind of like, you kind of get your bases covered either way, like, it's just kind of a negotiation.
It is with that buyer, so I hate the term value proposition, but that's what you're gonna be providing to them to get them to sign this contract. You know, what are you doing for them? That everyone's gonna have to do it.
You have to remember that in this industry, you're not a salesperson selling homes, you're selling yourself, your services, right?
Yeah. It is a good point, yes. Someone told me recently that you are your business card. So how you look, how you appear, how you speak, that is your best business card, right? They can't just throw you out like a traditional piece of paper business card. Brian doesn't even have any business cards. He doesn't need any. Yeah, he ripped something out of a flyer. I don't know what.
So is it the time that the buyer taking more money than the listing agent?
Is there, I think it's been happening a lot, as a matter of fact, at least not in this market, but in the past it has. I think in many cases, listing agents offered more, but not anymore. Can a buyer's agent earn more? Maybe.
That's what I asked.
Yeah, well, I guess anything's possible.
Did you tell that maybe they're offering the sales side and you negotiate with the buyers for 5%?
You could.
Like that, because
You can ask for 4 or 5%. Just better be demonstrating why you're that valuable to them. So payments from third parties, section D2. If the seller or listing agent or anyone is offering to compensate the agent representing the buyer, it will offset or be a credit against the buyer's obligation to pay the buyer's agent. And then cancellation notice. So non-exclusive, the default is I can send you written notice and the contract's canceled. Likewise, you as the agent can just send written notice. Or you can change the term. And then for an exclusive agreement, it's 30 days written notice. So nowhere in this form is it giving us an option to change it to 45 days, 60 days, or anything of that nature. And I don't know why.
You know, when the form changes, if you do have a, old form, would that become a grandfather?
The old form, well, I think the problem is going to be if you have the old form and you've structured the old buyer representation form such that you're willing to accept the money that's on the MLS, there's going to be no money offered on the MLS.
No. For the commission that the buyer has to give you their commission.
I understand that. But in many cases, when people fill out the current buyer representation agreement, they say, Mr. Buyer, I want you to pay me 2.5%, and you're going to get a credit from associated with the amount that's offered on the MLS. Does that make sense? But then if you filled it out that way and there's no money offered on the MLS, you're earning nothing. You might structure it such that I'm willing to accept anything that's offered on the MLS. So if you have an existing buyer representation agreement, we should look at how it's structured because we may want to terminate that agreement. Not that we can terminate it unilaterally. But if it's predicated upon you're willing to accept what's ever offered on the MLS and they buy a property after this transition and there's nothing offered on the MLS, you may not be earning anything.
So it's all depends on the verbiage.
It does, how that existing form is completed, yes. And then buyer's financial personal information. Well, scan down there, but here's an important part of this within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement. So if the buyer checks one of these 2 boxes, Buyer intends to purchase using a VA loan. So theoretically, FHA and traditional conventional financing will allow a buyer to pay for the buyer's agent's commissions. VA is not making any kind of a change. So the Veterans Administration will not allow a vet to pay for their buyer's agent's commissions. The seller must pay. It's a closing cost, right? Or buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay a broker. If one of those two boxes is checked and you're representing that buyer and we have an accepted offer and the seller or the listing agent is not willing to pay any of the commissions, you earn nothing. You can terminate your agency relationship with that buyer, but you spent all that time, energy, and money working with them.
So it would be more challenging for those that they work with VAs.
Yeah, I think it's certainly consideration you have to give, and it's terrible to think that veterans are going to be suffering from this. They may look at it and think, well, if the seller or the listing agent is not willing to pay, so what can you do? The only options, and this is typical of VA loans, for example, if the property's selling for, or the asking price is $1 million, usually the vet's going to come in and are willing to pay $1,020,000, $1,050,000, and then ask for a credit back. That's how you're going to have to structure your transaction if you're representing buyers that meet one of these two criteria and they check those boxes. You're going to have to be submitting an offer that's higher. And of course, the seller is going to evaluate that, suggesting, is it really going to appraise?
Mm-hmm.
If it doesn't appraise,
Right. Is right now, it's a limit to how much you are paying with the VA loan to a commission.
no, not, well, when you say paying for commission,
Like, you cannot exceed certain.
no, there's no limitation on the commission that the vet can pay. They can't pay any commission. That's really what it comes down to. Is that going to change in the future? I hope so, because it's certainly doing a disservice to these people who have risked their lives for our country. So let's go through the body of the transaction here.
Even if the vet offers to pay you,
You can't.
can't accept it.
It's illegal. Yeah. So you have to have the seller pay. You have to have the listing agent pay.
And when you say the VA will give like 1,050,000, is that like what the seller takes into consideration for like compensation from their end to you if you're representative of veteran?
Yeah, if I'm willing to pay $50,000 more than a property is worth.
Yeah.
And I'm asking for a credit back from the seller, asking the seller to pay my agent's commissions, that's acceptable. It's just the risk for the seller is, will it appraise? And if you're getting a VA loan, an amendatory clause is required, then that's a contractual obligation. And an amendatory clause states specifically, in the event the property doesn't appraise, the veteran can cancel without any reason whatsoever. Even if that person releases their appraisal contingency, they can still cancel. And that means they can actually control that transaction up till the day of close, because what if they decide, well, I'm not sure if I want to cancel? What can the seller do? Nothing. So it ties that property up.
And is no agreement to sign prior to that between the person who's want to obtain the VA loan and the agent?
No, you would sign. This is the agreement that they would sign.
Or they would sign that they are willing to pay you 20,000 for their.
No. My point is, on this, they're signing this agreement we're talking about, but if they check the box saying let's see, section F, buyer intends to purchase using a VA loan. If they sign this and a seller or listing agent is not willing to pay, you're entitled to no compensation.
That's what I am saying.
Okay.
So it's nothing in the back that.
There's no deals that are going to obligate the vet, the
And
person getting a VA loan, to pay you.
you might work with the person who want to obtain that loan, and at the end, they say no. Now that we want this property, so if it doesn't appraise, still we want to go for it. So it's just nothing would happen.
I guess I'm a little confused, but I guess if an offer is made and it doesn't appraise, and more importantly, if the seller or listing agent refused to pay the commission for the person who's getting a VA loan, you earn nothing.
So in that scenario, this would just be used as a contract to show property.
I guess so, yeah, you can, but your only option, if the seller or listing agent are not willing to pay the commission, is to cancel your agency relationship with the buyer. And that would be a horrible thing. And when you're working with somebody and they think, oh, you're just doing it for the money. Well, of course we're doing it for the money. Why? Well, that's why everybody's here, as a matter of fact.
So, if you're a listing agent, you are in the finance part, they accept FHA, VA, or cash, or as a listing agent. If you're a listing agent, you can say no VAs or FHA, or that would be.
No, that'd be discriminatory.
But now, if you have to accept it, implies that you have to give some commission in it.
No, it implies nothing. Because maybe the listing contract, the listing agent has what the seller says, the seller's not offering any compensation to the agent representing the buyer. There's no obligation. It's all part of the negotiation. It's part of you calling that listing agent in advance and saying, I've got a VA buyer and my financing is going to be represented as VA financing. I need to know, what I want from you in advance is a signed cooperating broker commission form that you're going to pay me. And if they refuse to do that, because let's assume they took a listing contract for 3%. Because on the listing contract, there's the amount that the seller's paying the listing agent. There's another field it says optional, how much they want to offer to the cooperating broker. So if they say nothing there, what could the listing agent is going to come out of pocket? Most likely not. Maybe you can negotiate that with them, say, could you contribute 1% of your 3%? That's a possibility. And then the other option is when you submit the offer, it's actually the buyer who's negotiating the commissions with the seller. The buyer, so the agent for the buyer is not negotiating with the seller to pay the buyer's agent's commission. The way the contract is going to be structured, it's going to be the buyer who's negotiating with the seller to pay the buyer's agent's commission. So the risk is the seller just says no.
So in your scenario, where, let's just say, i.e., it's 3% the listing agent, 0% to the buyer agent and the listing agent. Then I come over here with a VA client who I can't charge a commission to. The only option is if the buyer's agent negotiates with the listing agent directly, that the listing agent gives them part of the compensation.
That, right?
Make the deal work.
Yeah.
And that scenario would really only happen if it was like a super buyer's market.
That's not the only
Well,
option.
maybe not the only,
The
but
listing agent can negotiate with the seller, say, hey, look, this is a good offer. Are you willing to pay a percent? Right? And then you can.
well, I think
renegotiate
but it's the buyer who's negotiating
Right,
that.
right.
The buyer's going to the seller and saying, and hopefully the listing agent says, this is a good deal. You should give consideration to paying that commission or giving them a credit for closing costs.
So is that something we can add into the purchase agreement, the purchase contract, negotiate commissions?
I just said that.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
where? Like where?
We haven't gone over the purchase contract yet.
But
But that field will exist, allowing the buyer to negotiate with the seller to pay
Okay.
the buyer's agent's commissions.
So it would be a violation to decide on to tell the buyer, no, we don't want to negotiate it because they're paying money. You are obligated to help the buyer. anyway.
Well, I think you just have to give consideration if you're gonna talk to them, you're gonna take them through this. And it's gonna be a business decision for somebody. If you're gonna represent somebody who's getting VA financing, it's a gamble, unfortunately. But you can decline, as I said too many times, you can decline representation if you're not gonna be paid. So once you negotiated the transaction and neither the seller nor listing agent are unwilling to pay you, then you can decline representation.
Yeah. because
Then you look terrible.
Any liability is gonna be enough.
Yeah.
Even though you don't have anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a terrible situation. So we talked about section B1 on the screen, non-exclusive representation. What you must do to entitle yourself to commission if you have a non-exclusive agreement signed with the buyer. B2, exclusive representation. It's very simple, actually. Doesn't matter. If you have an exclusive agreement, and assuming the property falls within the characteristics or parameters you define, they're obligated to pay you during that representation period, right? And then also questions come up, section 3, buyer includes. If it's someone who's trying to circumvent you, it's a husband and a wife buys a property, or a related person to that person who signed the contract, you're still entitled to compensation. So it's very broad in regards to obligating the person who's signing this contract if they, once again, if they try to circumvent you.
Sneaky, sneaky.
Sneaky, huh? Witnessed that before. What was that? Yeah. And then continuation of right to compensation for broker involved properties. And this is no different than a listing contract. This is a protection clause. If at the end of the representation period, whether they cancel it or before it expires, you submit a list of properties you've shown them or what you provided information on, those are properties that you would be entitled to compensation for if the buyer thereafter proceeds and acquires one of those properties without you representing them. But you must submit a list of those properties. Payment through escrow, just you're going to be paid or will be paid as we normally are, right? And then accounting for payments to broker, if broker also represents seller. If I'm the listing agent and I represent both the seller and the buyer, the commission I'm receiving as the listing agent, just solely for listing the property, is not used as a credit against the commission that the buyer owes me as the buyer's agent. Any questions about that? Okay. What's that?
Let's go back to the.
Oh, you want to know?
The veteran understands all this, realizes he can't be charged by buyer's agent. So then he tries to go to the listing agent directly. But the listing agent will more than likely also charge him, but they can't charge him.
They can't.
Would want to charge him, but they can't.
They
charge him.
can't.
But is there any way that they could sign that one form that said, I'll do your paperwork, but I'm not responsible for you? I forgot what that was.
Buyer non-agency agreement. So for you to do the paperwork on behalf of that buyer,
Who happens to be a veteran.
well, I don't know who's going to pay you.
No, but you're the listing agent, so you're thinking you're.
Oh, I see. Yeah, the listing agent can do that. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Agent is like, oh, you know what, I'm going to be paid 3%. You know, he's a veteran.
Mhm.
I'll do the paper, I'll have to sign this. Even if it's not ideal for them, but technically that's within the law.
Yeah. It's not. The other side is, and I don't know what the answer to this, and that was a very good question, because if I have this signed and I've shown the property to that buyer, and then the listing agent writes it up. Now, if they have a non-agency agreement signed, does someone have a claim for procuring cause?
But there's no commission offered, right?
There's no commission
For
offered.
VA loan.
No, there's nothing offered. So yeah, I guess it seems like, as we talk about it, the listing agent could do that, have a buyer non-agency agreement signed and provide all the forms to the buyer just as an accommodation. And that's exactly what the non-agency agreement states. I'm going to provide these, but it's not on your behalf. It's on behalf of my client's behalf. So they could do that. Yeah.
Not that, being unrepresented is a bad idea, but I just was thinking about.
Yeah, seems like it. Seems unfair to the buyer's agent that brought that buyer there too, because then I've introduced you to the property and I'm getting nothing.
I was mostly thinking if they didn't.
Yeah, I see. They could.
They just went.
If that's the only offer, then I would assume that the listing agent might do it, right?
Yeah, that's why I was going back to this, would have to give buyers markets.
It seems like it. I would agree with you.
So the only time that would be an issue is if the listing agent negotiates an extra commission from the seller to pay the buyer's commission.
Yes.
Then the other agent would be.
Yes, in the listing contract,
Yeah.
if the seller agreed to the optional commission to be paid to the buyer's agent, then yes. You could do that. So when you're listing property, do you think it's helpful to a seller that you're offering compensation to a buyer's agent? I'd say you
Yeah.
are, right? Yeah, I think so. I think you're more likely to get more people making offers. And buyers aren't going to have the money in many cases to pay for the commission anyways. Or they're going to have to, in a sense, pay more and lump it into the loan.
So just recently, when one of our agents submitted an offer, got accepted. They had an agreement with the buyer for 2.5%, and the listing side was offering 2%. And they were accepted, everything went fine, and then they realized that they're gonna have to pay 0.5%. They're like, why didn't you negotiate that extra 0.5%? It's like, are you kidding me? I just got you out of 2%.
Yeah. And then section 7A talks about the buyer signing multiple representation agreements. They could be responsible for more than one commission if they've done that. Unless they've excluded certain particular properties. And then broker authorizations and obligations. It says all the things that we're going to be doing on behalf of the buyer's behalf. And then financial and personal information. Let's see, we should be getting, let's pull up the form CBC. The new form CBC. So it resembles the existing form. We're going to identify the seller's broker, the property address. Section 2, we're going to identify the buyer's brokerage firm. If you're representing the buyer, that's going to be us also. And then this is simply an agreement between the agent representing the buyer and the agent representing the seller. So offer regarding compensation. So we talked about it. If the listing agent does advertise compensation, well, you have to formalize that in this document. So it'll say how much that they're offering. And then section 4, sale the tenant procured by buyers, tenants, brokers. I don't see anybody using this, but if I represented a buyer in a lease situation and that buyer decides to buy the property, well, Mr. Seller, you have to pay me a certain commission. I think that's going to be a hard sell. And then let's say broker instruction to escrow holder. This will serve as a demand to escrow. So if there's a question about the commission, we simply submit this to escrow and they have to honor this. So it talks about dispersing the commission that's outlined in this agreement. And remember, commission could virtually come from a number of places. It can come from the listing agent. It can come from the seller also. And it could also come from the buyer. If I want 3% representing you, Mr. Buyer, the seller's willing to pay 1, the listing broker's willing to pay 1, you have to pay 1. So that'll be calculated in escrow, as a matter of fact.
And this should be sent before submitting your offer.
I would definitely submit that form before submitting my offer. Because even if they, currently on the MLS, if you see an offer of compensation and you notify the listing agent, I'm submitting an offer tonight, and they change the compensation thereafter on the MLS, they're obligated to pay you the compensation that was offered at the time you notified them. Whereas now, it seems to me, and they'll create a bad reputation for themselves, but if they advertise it somewhere and you don't get it signed, maybe they change it, say, that was wrong. So you should be submitting this to the listing agent in advance of submitting that offer. So you know categorically. It's not only that, but you're going to have to notify your buyer. I need to give some kind of documentation. It could be, the documentation could be that cooperative broker commission form. It could be from their website in terms of their offer of compensation. So the buyer understands what their net obligation will be, if any. Let's see. And then buyer material issues, we looked at form BIPP. So this is what we want, or they should be stating what they don't want, as a matter of fact. They don't have to fill this out. And then if for some reason you sign an agreement and the company doesn't like the terms, we can cancel within 5 days, but the buyer cannot cancel. And we talk about mediation and mediation terms. So nothing unusual there, right? No different than a listing contract or in a sense, the purchase agreement.
So does this mean we have to review these, Rich, when?
We
they're
should
signed?
be, we're gonna have to get all of these. Unfortunately. It's no different than a listing contract. And then legally authorized signer. Well,
Excuse me, what could be the reason that the company wouldn't like it?
well, I'll give you an example. Somebody signed a listing contract with zero compensation to us. And maybe someone representing a buyer, because they liked them so much, said, oh, you don't have to pay me anything. I'm not going to engage in that. I'm here to make money too. And the risk just isn't worth it. So yeah, that could be a reason. And then
So
legally, what was that?
Would that be a new policy
Would that be a new policy?
that they have to submit?
Yeah,
their
yeah.
Contract?
We have to get those, right? That's our obligation anyway, as a broker. We have an obligation to obtain that documentation. Legally authorized signer. So the other aspect of the contract, what they have to do, they should be giving you evidence that they qualify for the loan. In addition to that, what if it's an entity? If it is an entity, they should be providing supporting documentation that they have the authority to represent that entity. So if it's a family trust, it could be a certification of trust, or it could be a copy of their trust. If it's an LLC, the operating agreement. So that's something you are required to obtain, because how do you know, once again, that the person signing this has the authority to act on behalf of that entity? And you also are entitled, according to contractually, to get copies of their bank statements, for example, to prove they have the funds. So you should be getting that. We should always be getting that anyways. And a pre-approval letter if they're going to be getting a loan. We talked about exclusive representation. That's the ideal situation. You pay me. Is that a fire alarm? And then we talked about confirmation of compensation. What? Oh, I see. It goes under section 16 again. So we're going to confirm the compensation that we talked about earlier, just to remind them of what they're paying. And then the signature lines.
I wonder if this is going to auto-populate from the first page, or if you have to enter it again when you're filling it out.
I don't know. That's a good question. You'd like to think it would, save some time as a matter of fact, because it's virtually the same information. And then the other thing you're obligated to, as we talked about, you're obligated to give them notification of the compensation that you're going to be earning on various properties. So this form, anticipated broker compensation disclosure, is referenced in the buyer representation broker contract or commission agreement. You are not obligated to use this form. So if you gave them an alternative source of documentation, maybe from a listing agent's website or some other form of publication showing that the listing agent's offering 2.5% to you, you don't have to fill that information in on this form. And the form specifically says that. Personally, if I'm representing a buyer, I'm not likely to give them this form to spell out specifically how much money I'm earning on each and every property, or could earn on each and every property that I'm going to be showing you. And you should be giving them information reasonably in advance of showing their property, how much compensation, if any, is being offered on that property that you're going to be showing them. So you can have a discussion with them to talk to them about, well, this is why you're going to be paying me. What are the advantages and disadvantages of working with me? And why would you come out of pocket possibly if we cannot convince the seller to pay for the amount that you owe me?
Interesting. Before, there were some agents that were not showing properties because of the low commission being offered. And now there might be some properties that buyers don't want to look at because they're not offering any commission.
That's a good point. They may not, because if I don't have the money to pay for your commission, or the seller's not offering it, I don't want to look at that property. It's doing a disservice to the sellers.
Yeah.
I think that's such a good point. I think that's something, when you're on a listing presentation, you should be telling a seller. It's likely it's not just the agent, it's probably the buyer that's not gonna wanna come to your house because you're gonna make the buyer not only pay a premium price for the property, then they're gonna have to pay their agents commissions too. And how many more buyers are gonna be coming to your property because you're doing it that way?
You
Good
know,
point.
I think it's a little bit of a mindset, like they are paying their foreclosing costs, you know,
Mhm.
like when they are getting a loan, they pay the percentage of a commission, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, and so they expecting, in the beginning might be a little bit hard to get used to that mindset, but later on,
Yeah, it's good. It's hard enough for us to educate ourselves in regards to this whole transition, but then the general public,
yeah, it's. very
they're not
hard.
gonna have any understanding why now, for you to show a property, they have to sign a contract. Or they're gonna have to sign an open house disclaimer or something like that to come in and see a property that's available to be shown. Yeah, it's gonna be a big change in regards to the mindset. Well,
Yeah.
you just had 2 buyer representation agreements signed recently, right?
Yeah,
At what, 2.5%, 3%,
2.5.
2.5? Very good. What did you tell them?
I told them
Oh,
that
worth it.
the law is changing,
Hmm.
and as you heard on news, so that the buyer agent pay for their own and the seller agent pay for their own. So I just wanted you to know that from now on, we're going to see a lot of houses. I don't know how long would it take, but again, this is what I charge.
Okay. And they didn't question the percentage. It's
No, I
good.
said this is what it is.
Oh, okay, that's great. This is what it is. Remember, I think the papers, we talked about this, the news
Yeah,
services did us,
yeah, but I
they,
told them what is the benefit of working with.
yeah, you have to, right?
Yeah.
So fortunately,
What makes me different than other agents?
Yeah. your value proposition. So fortunately, all these news outlets publish the fact that commissions are 6%. You tell them, you've seen that in the news, that's what they are, right? I'm only gonna charge you 2.5%. Right? Because you're paying for it anyways.
You know, mostly they see it because they go through Zillow and they
Mhm.
see it like a 2.5%.
They do.
commission
I see.
To a buyer
Mhm.
agent. So they are used to that in their.
Got it.
But now it's just like you pay for it and they pay for that.
So then it becomes the question, do you get them to sign a non-exclusive or an exclusive agreement?
So we have a question on Zoom. It says, Ella's asking, what's the commission situation like on representing a buyer on a short sale or foreclosure property? And then, yeah, so there's that question.
I don't think it's gonna be any different because it's the seller who's going to have to agree to the commission, and the terms of a short sale are subject to bank approval anyways. So if there's an offer submitted on a short sale, the buyer may accept the terms because it's still the buyer's property. But then the bank is gonna make a decision, how much am I netting? Am I willing to participate in that and approve the short sale? So I think it's just an additional step. That's really what we're gonna see.
And then Jim Carpenter's asking, what about open house? Do buyers have to sign just to walk into the open house?
Yes, there's 2 different documents, one which is not as aggressive. They give their name and information, but then there's a second form. I don't remember the names of the forms at this point in time. But on that second form, which I would recommend that they sign, it asks for the name, because if they don't, I guess if they don't have representation by an agent, then they have to sign one of these forms with you. So in the second form that I'm suggesting, it asks them specifically for the name of the brokerage that they're working with. And if they don't know that, then they're lying. So that's how we can pull that out. But there is at least a document indicating you're not representing them. Any information that's being provided to them is on behalf of the seller. But that form I probably wouldn't use myself. I would want them to sign their own individual form, in which they're telling me whether they are or are not represented by an agent. And it also tells them, if you wish representation, I can represent you.
But what about the
I don't know, but I'm gonna make the assumption that this is all gonna be applicable to lease transactions also, because there will be no offer of compensation on the MLS. So I think the guidelines are gonna be the same. unfortunately. Yeah. Well, it's good or bad for leases, but,
You know, in one of your presentation, you mentioned that, like, when they are interviewing you, it means that they interview other people too. And you said that, I think it's good that you interview others, and now it's me, so let me tell you why me.
yeah, you need to be prepared,
Yeah.
for what you're talking about. And
Exactly.
we'll go through it again, but I think in the past, we talked about maybe a recommendation at the presentation. Before, how many of you actually, when you're working with the buyer, went through their purchase contract, so they understood the purchase contract in advance? I'm gonna guess, oh, there's one. Oh, you have a question, or are you saying that you?
Both, but yeah.
Okay, all right, so we have at least one person that's gone through the purchase contract in advance to help, okay, you do, before you even show them property.
Yeah.
Well, that's great.
Because you said that they have to know what is that.
Yeah, they have to know. That gives them confidence. Okay, I know what to expect. So that's part of the presentation that I would
Yeah.
use when speaking to a buyer to get them to sign this representation agreement.
Just a quick question regarding the census section. So I know we're not obligated to actually disclose this, but if we are specifically asked for this, do we have a choice? not
You
to?
do. The form even says that we don't have to provide it if we've given you the information through an alternative source. So you have no obligation to provide this particular document. Print out from the website, or if you have a cooperating broker commission form signed, that's ideal actually, because now we have a hard and fast number. So yeah, you have no obligation to use this form.
You know, the purchasing agreement form that you mentioned,
Mhm.
that we go through it in a presentation. I add this line to it. I want to go over this because later on when I'm sending you this to be signed, I want you to have an idea that what is the context of which.
Yeah, I think it's very helpful. It builds their confidence in you. So you tell them, I understand this document. It's lengthy, and I can help structure it to save you money to help. So this is how we're going to be doing it. I think it's a good presentation. Was there a question?
Yeah, Rick had a question.
What's
I
that?
didn't understand the question.
Did you have a question?
ABCD, that form.
Huh?
When you go to the buyer's home, you need to take that.
You do
form
not.
with you.
You do not. The point is, this is referenced in the buyer representation broker compensation agreement. This form is it's referenced in there. But the form itself even states that if you've given them information in terms of the compensation offered by the seller or the listing agent in advance, you don't have to put it on this form. So you can just avoid it. You can just give them a printout of something and say, here's the compensation that's being offered. You don't have to formalize it on this document. I would not suggest using this. All it does is lays it out clearly. Is that what we want? We want them to focus on buying a house, not how much they're paying me for this property, this property, this property. And now I know why you're forcing me to this property on Longview, because they're paying 10%. And then about leases, Sarah, something else that has come up a couple of times. I just want to mention this to you. And Cameron, you brought this up just yesterday. The clear cooperation policy, and this is off the subject, requires you to put a property on the MLS within 1 day of marketing the property, 1 business day of marketing the property. And so we're finding different examples in which people are taking lease listings and they're not putting them on the MLS. So I've talked to Sarah Melissa's general counsel going back to at least January this year. They're wrong. They're not enforcing the policy on lease listings. So we're finding people that are putting listings on Zillow, not putting on the MLS currently. And of course, Cameron's client was very unhappy. So when I called and spoke with their general counsel, if you look through the MLS rules and regulations, which they still have not modified, but if we make a mistake, they're going to fine us. But I found a mistake in the rules and regulations, and it defines a lease as the same as a sale. So a sale is subject, or a property for sale includes leases. So keep that in mind. So there are holes in the system in regards to what's taking place and how they're enforcing that guideline with the clear cooperation policy.
What about an exclusion form? To exclude it from the MLS?
Why does it matter if you're marketing it? Just exclusion form is meaningless if you market the property.
So I'm sorry, just to clarify
Mhm.
that, it means that you cannot just put it in a zero and not in a MLS.
No, what I'm saying is the rules and regulations state that you must, even for a lease listing, put it in the MLS. But there are those individuals that are not for a lease listing. They're putting it on Zillow. And the MLS is not enforcing the rule on lease listings.
Okay, how about listing?
Huh?
Not the lease, but just.
Lease listing, because the clear cooperation policy requires you, if you're marketing your property, to put it on the MLS within 1 business day.
So it is must to be on a MLS, no
It-
matter.
I would say it's best to be on the MLS, but then there are those agents that are just advertising it directly on Zillow without it going on the MLS. So then your clients don't see it and they look at you as if you're not doing a good job, unfortunately, right, Cameron?
Yep.
Yep.
Recently got fired yesterday. So much fun.
Yeah.
So what is our answer to those people?
What is our answer? I wish I had a good answer, but I'm going to continue to contact their general counsel and say, first of all, they told me they're going to change it, and they never did. And we've run into this on a number of occasions. Actually, Samantha Buckwalter in the past came across an entire website from this company with lease listings, and none of them were on the MLS.
But this commission, understand,
I'm sorry, what?
effective
It's anticipated to roll out the week of June 25th.
So if the listing overlaps the time, let's say, you have a listing and you offer 3%. And on the 20th, and during the MLS,
Mhm.
the 21st, you have to take it out.
You have to take, well, you're
And
not,
the commission,
they're just removing the field.
oh.
Yeah, they're just gonna remove the field. It's not gonna be available.
Huh.
And if you have an existing offer, you're still entitled to the compensation that's offered on the MLS.
So in that case, when you are asking 5% from a seller
Uh-huh.
and it's not on a MLS, you can claim it all and not to give it to the other agent, right? If
Well,
they are
on the new
removing it.
listing contract, which I do not have on the screen.
Yeah.
I'll qualify that. There's 2 fields. One field states how much the listing agent's earning. The next field, which is titled optional, how much money is being offered to the agent representing the buyer.
Thank
Where
you.
before it's total commission.
It was total commission, right? And you didn't have to fill out the amount that you were going to offer the cooperating broker previously. It was suggested, but it was not mandatory in the current listing contract. But in that case, if they're offering the optional compensation to the agent representing the buyer or tenant, you can double it. So you're entitled to that compensation as the listing agent.
So if you're the listing agent for a lease property. Trying to sort this out of my head, and you know, people just come to you, right, to buy the property. Then you would just tell these people who are the potential tenants what you charge. If you,
Theoretically, because that's the question Sarah had, does this apply to leasing activity? I don't know why it would be any different at this point in time, but you would have to show a property, you're going to have to do one of 2 things. You're going to have a buyer representation agreement signed. Or if you're holding an open house, then the seller form signed. So theoretically, yeah,
so everybody has to fill out one of those 2 forms, I've given either or.
yeah. Leases have not been the subject so far of what they're trying to do, but I don't see why it would be any different. I haven't heard anything excluding leasing activity.
And
This,
you would have the buyer check their brokerage or their
the buyer, yeah,
tenant.
yeah, actually, that's a good point.
You pay.
Yeah, there's no escrow company, exactly. So, and you can do that currently, assuming that's always seems to be, well, that's a good question. That's a very good question. Because if the landlord's not offering any compensation, why would the tenant's payment go to the landlord in turn pay the cooperating broker? So you'd have to have the tenant pay you directly. That's what seems logical to me also. But that's yet to be seen. I'm sorry, what?
You mean like paid directly by paid brokerage?
Right, yes. If you're representing the tenant, usually, not in all cases, the tenant writes a check to the landlord for first month's rent. And then the landlord then pays the commissions to the listing agent, or they may pay listing agent separately and the broker representing the tenant, or they may just pay the listing office, and the listing office is obligated to pay the cooperating agent, the tenant's agent, if that makes sense.
You kind of still tell them, yeah, buyer and, okay, do a check this for this, broker, the listing for the, buyer agent, and that's part of the deposit.
Well, I think they're separate and distinct events, though. You know, when the buyer or the tenant is writing a check to the landlord for first month's rent and deposit, it's the landlord who's obligated, has been obligated to pay the commissions. In this case, it could be the tenant who's obligated to pay their agent's commissions. Unless the listing agent is offering commission, or the tenant negotiates with the landlord, this is what I would suspect, that the landlord pay my tenant representations or my agent's commissions as a tenant. So it's complicating things.
I'm sorry, you
That's right.
might already said that, but I just want to understand it better. You know, on a car, when you are, the listing agent would send you a form right now. It said that would be my commission. This would be the percentage for the buyer commission. And if I'm a dual agent, so this is what I charge at this time.
No, it doesn't spell it out that way. On the listing contract, that's what we're talking about, the listing contract that is due for release late June. It's gonna have a field that says, this is how much you, Mr. Seller, are paying me to list the property.
No, but I'm just saying currently. This
Oh,
is what
currently.
it is, yes.
Yes,
But, so, and then this would be so when it said 2.5%, for instance, for the listing agent.
Hmm.
So in week of June 25th, if I have a contract with the listing agent for the 90 days, then what would happen?
I'd say the contract's enforceable. Just the compensation that you may be offering will not be shown on the MLS.
Nice.
So Rich, we have another question. How about if you're a buyer and you're representing yourself?
Well, if you're representing yourself and you go directly, are we suggesting you're going directly to the listing agent? Is that the question?
That's
Okay.
all she asked.
Okay. So if you're representing yourself, you can go directly to the listing agent. It's no different than you could right now. But a listing agent has a listing contract with the seller stating the seller is not going to pay commission to any agent representing the buyer. The listing agent could just make a decision. I'm willing to simply just represent the seller. And you, Mr. Buyer, are going to have to sign a buyer non-agency agreement with me. I understand I won't earn anything from you, but I'm not sure why they would do that. That's just it. As a listing agent, I think you've got the ability to say, that's great. I want to help you, but I can't work for free. So you can actually, why not have them sign that buyer representation agreement? But if you don't want to, and that's the only buyer in the world that's approached you, you may decide to only be compensated by the seller, have the buyer sign a buyer non-agency agreement, and that entitles you to provide all the documentation that you normally would in a transaction to the buyer. It assists them, but you're doing it on behalf of the seller. I don't know how many listing agents are going to want to do both sides for no additional compensation. Any other questions in the chat box?
Nope. She's
Okay.
Thank you.
Just one more time, go through the forms that are gonna be, so the buyer agreement, representation agreement, that's the first form we gotta go to, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then following that, is there any other forms that we have to add?
To add, well, what's going to take place, just like with the residential purchase agreement, there's going to be the agency disclosure, there's probably gonna be the wire fraud disclosure. The PRBS is going to be included, so all those different documents, and then the Form BCA buyer commission agreement, so there's gonna be the minimum documents that are going to accompany the BRBC. Yes, so yeah, it's never gonna be as simple as, unfortunately, the one document we're looking at. Never. Okay.
It kind of like adds more thousand to us.
I think it does. I think, actually, I think this whole presentation makes us appear, if it doesn't matter if it's your accountant, your attorney, you have to sign an engagement letter. I think it's adding to the profession in itself. If I'm going to work with you, you're going to have to sign a contract. And everyone's going to require that, just like the legal profession or the accounting profession. When you get your taxes done, you've got to sign an engagement letter. Same thing with legal representation. I think it's very beneficial. So those people that act professionally and present it that way, I think, and it doesn't matter what we want anyways, we're going to have to do it. So let's just embrace it.
I also think bring more value, because at this time, it's a mindset of some people that I go directly to them, and this way I can get some discounts. But with the new law, whatever it is, it should be disclosed. So I cannot just say I give, you charge me only 5,000 or 10,000. And you give me 5,000, 10,000 discount.
Yeah.
So really it works.
And buyers can't abuse you as they did in the past, right?
Yes,
Run you around, help them, and then suddenly go to a listing agent and
exactly.
buy directly through the listing agent.
Yeah.
Or ask for half your commission.
Yeah, ask for half your commission. Hey, we're going to sign that up front. You're going to negotiate that up front, because they're going to be asking everybody, as a matter of fact, if they're willing to do that. So that's not going to be anything unusual, but no, I think it adds to the profession. Unfortunately, it complicates it, but then that, I think, requires buyers to rely on us even more.
And imagine you have an open house and people are lining and you want to negotiate the commission.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for
Richard, I have one question.
What's that?
Okay, so let's say after the June 25th period, when somebody takes a listing, you do a cumulative market analysis. Since there's this change in commissions, do you automatically suggest to your seller to price the property, let's say on $1 million home, $20,000 less, because now this expense is not embedded in your deal as a seller, so that you can attract more buyers?
Yeah, that's the fallacy behind this whole thing. I'm in the industry. If I'm selling my house, I'm going to get the most money for my house I possibly can. I am not going to be reducing my price by $20,000. I don't think any seller is going to be giving that consideration. That's the whole fallacy behind this thing. I can't imagine people just saying, I got to reduce it because I don't have to pay as much commission.
Yeah, what's in the news is saying that they're saying that prices were inflated because of commissions.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with it.
Now it's going to be more costly. You can, I think, if I'm a seller, and what I hear from so many listing agents in the office, there aren't many sellers who are willing to price their property lower. As a matter of fact, Holden has a transactional listing. It's parents and son on the listing that own the property. And then he gets an offer for $1,550,000, the asking price, and the agreed upon listing price is $1,600,000. And what does the son do? Once they get an all cash offer for $1,550,000, well, I'm not willing to sell for any less than $1,700,000. So now he wants $100,000 more than the asking price on the MLS. Now, maybe that's an extreme example of greed, and maybe they're testing Holden, but that's That's the seller's mindset right now. They're not going to give up anything. They want more. So that would be hard to argue. It's just, I think we're having some examples of people that are somewhat familiar with what's taking place and now are complaining because they've signed a listing contract and they're having to pay the buyer's agent's commissions. And these are same people who have priced this particular property $500,000 over what it's worth. So that's the mindset. Okay. Well, hey, thanks for coming, everybody. It's good to see you today. Right. Okay.
No drawing today?
Oh, we do have the
Thank
drawing.
you, Richard. Very
Anybody want to take a couple of cards? Has everybody put a card in here? No, okay. And not more than one card.